Hey there everybody, today we're going to be painting a jump pack Ultramarine Intercessor. So, let's get into it, after this guy stops spinning around. So I'll start with a black undercoat. It's a nice shiny one, it's the Molotov black that I use sometimes. And I'm giving it a zenithal prime with some titanium white ink. Just nice coverage using the airbrush to get some good shape to those armor panels. Then I'm going to use the airbrush again with the Macragge blue for that perfect blueberry blue just for the Ultramarines. I do think that the airbrush is one of the greatest investments you can make if you're going to be painting a lot of minis, especially for undercoating, but if you've got Space Marines in your army, doubly so. Covering all these panels with the airbrush is just so easy. Okay, now I've kept this in, although it is a mistake. I'm using Bile Red here, and I'm painting the helmet of just the captain, lieutenant, leader of the little squad. And what I did was I actually didn't wait long enough for the undercoat, the ink to dry, and you can see what happens here on just the top right hand side of his helmet is that the undercoat just peels away, which is a bit of a shame because it was a really lovely colour. But I don't want to go and undercoat everything again, so you can see it's just peeled away there. Tried to fix it, but it doesn't work, so I'll come back again and fix that later with some Mephiston red. Now I'm going to give the whole model a good dry brush with some Calgar blue, and this is going to give some more shape to those panels. I'm not a big fan of edge highlighting, I've said it before, so I try to avoid it where I can, except in circumstances where it's really needed. So this dry brush is just going to add that shape. Black Legion contrast paint, because the contrast paint I find flows into these little nooks and crannies a little easier for the under armor area. But we want to be super careful now with what we're applying, because fixing anything is going to be a little difficult now that we've applied that dry brush for shape on the armor. The makeup brush really is the most underrated and cost-effective tool for dry brushing. They work fantastically, cost next to nothing, very easy to maintain. But back to the Black Legion, we're using the Black Legion contrast paint, getting all the under armor area, and we're also getting the plasma pistol here. So with all those areas of black based in, we're going to use Retributor armor for all of the gold, all of his little trinkets, the edges of his pauldrons, the handle of his sword, and obviously the big eagle and skull on his chest, who are nice and bright. But we're using the Retributor armor, it's got a slightly richer colour to it, and just works really well as a base for these fancy golden areas. So again, just being super careful, small strokes with a well-loaded brush, just to get all these areas nice and clean. We don't want to go onto the armor panels if we can absolutely avoid it, because fixing it's going to be difficult. And these the shoulder pauldron trims are usually one of the biggest areas for mistakes to come in. And then, last but not least, going to get you there on the handle. And I do actually paint one of the parts of his weapon here in Retributor gold and Retributor armor. Sorry. Not really that keen on it, so I actually go back and fix it a little later with some lead belcher. But yeah, all the gold getting based in there, and then we're using some Rhinox hide, one of the best brown colours there is, I think, for all the leather. Being super careful with all the tiny little straps and all those hard to reach areas. We want to make sure that we get them all, because it's not the easiest model to paint in sub-assemblies. But we also don't want to miss any areas so that they stand out as bright blue when they're supposed to be leather. So we're getting into those little straps that go around his leg, holding all those amazing little pouches onto him. And giving this 2 coats, because for some reason my Rhinox hide is a little thin. But there we go. All the leather, one shade, and we'll come back and give this some shape later with some washes. Again, not a fan of the edge highlighting, so I tried to stay away from it. Good old lead belch now for all of the metal areas. Blade of his sword, obviously a nice big metal area, but also looking for all those tiny little details. So we'll go in a second, you'll see, you can see there where I did the Retributor gold, the Retributor armor, and I'm now covering it with lead belcher because I feel like it just fits the weapon a bit more. I'm not sure that he'd have some fancy golden parts to his weaponry. So I'm also going to use this lead belcher to bring some life to just a few areas of his armor, like the exhaust ports on his legs and on his power pack. Not the big exhaust ports for the actual jump pack thrusters. We're going to come to that a little bit later, but I want these exhaust ports that he's obviously using for steering on his legs, and I'm going to do the underneath of his feet because there's no way, if he's jumping up and down and running around, that his feet would still be painted blue. It'll be etched off. Then titanium white ink, I'm going to go in just some of those tiny details like the little buttons on his arms and the eyes on his helmet. You can see here I've fixed this with Mephisto red. And then I'm just making sure I'm being super careful, keeping it inside, always keeping some Q-tips, I think most people call them, but earbuds on the side for cleaning up just in case. I'm also getting the little plasma glow area of his plasma pistol with the white because I'm going to come back and contrast paint that later. Mephisto red just for the wax seal on his purity seal there. It's a great colour. I tend to use Mephisto red for it most of the time, unless there's a reason for me to use a pinker colour or a deeper red, just to give that contrast. But this red against that blue is absolutely amazing. I'm using Wraithbone for the actual purity seals themselves, just because it's a nice off but slightly creamier white. So it's got a little bit of age to it, and then when we wash this later, it really gives it an aged feel. And then some watered down warpstone glow for the eyes. On the rest of the squad, they have red eyes, but red eyes on a red helmet doesn't really stand out or offer a lot of contrast. And we want that contrast to draw attention to that point on the model, so green for the leader here. Frostheart blue contrast paint all over that plasma area. Gives it a little shape, and then we'll come back again later with some white just to cut out some details so it really has a fairly simple glow effect to it. And then a little bit of Frostheart blue just onto this little power node on his sword. I'm not going for some big crazy effect, just want to break it up a little bit and make sure that it's obvious that this is a little different from the rest of it. Now, titanium white ink I'm putting inside of this thruster. It's obviously been undercoated in black and didn't get any of the zenithal prime. And to get a nice thruster effect, it's a very simple one. We need to get the inside of this white so that when we start painting with the brighter colours like oranges and yellows, we get a good coverage and a nice bright pop. Because if we do that on the black undercoat, it's obviously going to take quite a few coats of paint just to get that feeling, and we want to avoid any more work than absolutely necessary. So a quick coat in here with white really helps bring that effect to life. Bile red for the little buttons on his wrist, and then I'm using Reikland Flesh Shade on all of the gold areas, so especially on the eagle on his chest, where I'm trying to make sure that I'm keeping as much of that wash in the recesses of those wings and not wash the whole thing too much. And then you can see here applying quite heavily to start with, and then using the brush to wick it back and then work into those curves. I don't want to cover the entire golden area with it, I just want the recessed parts to have some shape to them. I'm also using the Reikland Flesh Shade here on the leather areas, but I'm not just painting it as a solid coat. What I'm doing is I'm working into just the recesses, and that way I don't get too shiny of an effect, but I do get some shape in the shadows. So as you can see there, I'm also using it on the purity seals, and I want to give it a good wash, but then in the areas where it's folded, the underneath areas of those folds, I'm making sure I get a little pool of the Reikland Flesh Shade, and that way we get a good shadow effect. Now Magmadroth Flame, just because I think it's got a really good intense orange colour, and that contrast helps it flow into, the contrast properties help it roll into those areas. Very roughly, just literally colouring in that entire inside area. What happens here is some of that orange is going to get onto the areas that aren't undercoated, but it'll still sell the effect, it won't be too much of a problem. Nuln Oil, good old Nuln Oil, absolutely all over all the metal areas. Now this is actually a different model that I'm showing because I didn't have the footage from the actual captain that I was painting, but all the metal areas are getting a coat of Nuln Oil. So now we're going back to the captain himself with flash gets yellow, and we're going back into that thruster, and what we're doing is we're just going into the middle. We're not going all the way to the edge where we have all of the orange, because we want some orange working its way into a brighter feeling where the core of that thruster is burning. So yellow in the middle, leaving some orange on the edges, then we'll come back again to this layer once the flash gets yellow is dry. And then I'm going to use some Stormhost Silver over the top of that null oil wash, and what I'm doing here is I'm just doing the cutting edge of that blade, so it's subtle, but it brings it forward from the rest of the blade, makes it look a little sharper and a little cleaner, like it's in use, and just helps it look more like a blade with a sharpened edge. Evil Sun Scarlet, one of the best reds that Citadel do, Games Workshop, and I'm using this to highlight just the topmost parts of his helmet, especially that ridge, the forehead, and a little bit of the shape of the helmet, just to bring it to life. Really bright colour here, and really bring some contrast to that head. And then titanium white ink, very carefully with the edge of the brush along the edge of that blade to make it look super sharp. And then staying with the titanium white ink, I'm literally just dropping a little part into the very centre of this thruster, and it really makes that pop. Now I'm using a mineral oil and black oil paint wash for the armour. Now you can use null oil to do this, it's not a problem, but I prefer to use this oil wash because the wicking properties of the solvent in mineral oil mean that it flows really nicely into the recesses, and I like my washes to be fairly thin, so you'll see they'll be quite shiny here. So you can see it flowing into those recesses very easily as I just dot it against the surface. There you go, look at that. Gets all into the edges, and I can actually move the model around to help it flow just a little bit, and then that way I get into all the areas that I want it to be. I do get some coverage in areas that maybe I don't want it to be, but because the mineral oil and the oil paint takes so long to dry, I've got loads and loads of time to come back and work with this. So I'm dropping on fairly heavily, and then as you can see here, just with a piece of paper towel, you can do this with some cotton wool or cotton buds, Q-tips if you want to call them that, and just take away from the areas that you don't want it to be in. So where it's too heavy, you can use the corners and edges just to mop up a little area. You can just take away some from areas that you don't want any at all, and a lot of that shine, like 99% of that shine, will dry out once the mineral oil actually dries. As you can see there, a lot of that shine's gone because it's dried. It takes a long time to dry, so this is overnight. And then I'm going into the base with some Eshin Grey, lovely dark bluish grey, and I'm just going to give the whole base a nice good covering with that. Again, into all the areas of the base with the Eshin Grey, just being careful not to get it onto the base of his feet because I don't want to spoil the work I've done there already. And now I'm just having my secret sauce for my Space Marines is some Necron compound, very lightly applied with a small dry brush, and I'm just working into the areas where I feel like there's going to be a lot of wear, especially around his feet and ankles, but then in areas where he's likely to have caught himself, so like obviously there in the butt armor area where he may have sort of been knocked over, in the elbows, on the edges of his wrists, just to give it some, it gives it a little weathering and age, and just gives it a bit more shape and highlight. And then I'm using some Liberator Gold on the edges of the gold areas, taking back from where the wash may have overreached, so those have got some lovely highlights. Mechanica Standard Grey, I'm giving a fairly generous dry brush into the base with the Mechanica Standard Grey, just to bring out some of the texture in that cork base that I've added. And then again, fairly generously but not too heavy with Administratum Grey, focusing mostly on the edges of the base, just to give it some really good shape. Just spotted this little skull, actually didn't even see it earlier on, so I added the Wraithbone to the skull, and then I gave that a wash with some Reikland Fresh Aid, and then I found that I felt that wasn't quite dark enough because I wanted it to be darker and less contrasty on the base, so I ended up with Agrax Earthshade. And I'm using Lead Belcher on these tiny little metal details that stick out, and then leave all that to dry. Now, wet on the model, wet on the decals, and the decals are being applied. I do have a separate video for just how easy these decals are to add. I'll try and link that for you. And so he's got his assault decal on his shoulder, one on his knee. You can see on the shoulder it's actually slipped a little bit, so I do go back and fix that. And then that nice big Ultramarine U on the other side. Just falls nicely into place. Then using the wet brush to move it around into the right position, and then just leave those to air dry so everything stays in place. Okay, now I'm using some magic in a bottle, dirty down rust, just applied quite heavily all over all those metal areas on just the base, so they look like more like rusted metal sticking out of concrete. And there you go, you can see it just being applied nice and generously. Takes a while to dry, it's a little bit smelly, but just make sure you give it a good shake, and it's a really good investment of a product. And then some Black Legion contrast paint all around the edge just to finish the model off. Nice clean base. There we go. And then he's done. So if you like the video, give us a like and subscribe, and keep on making more, and we'll see you in the next one.